So once again, welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Abby Funnelwald. I'm the in-store events manager here. And tonight, I'm so pleased to welcome Paul Greenberg to discuss his new book, American Catch. The book is an in-depth investigation into the global seafood industry and analyzes how some sustainable resources are being revived and some wild fisheries remain. And more specifically, the book highlights many of America's most important seafood sources, New Orleans shrimp, New York oysters, and Bristol Bay salmon. So Mr. Greenberg, of course, is the author of the best-selling For Fish and is a New York Times contributor and a Pew Fellow. And we are so pleased that he's here tonight with us to share his latest work. So please join me in welcoming him to Politics and Prose.
Hello. Very nice to be back at Politics and Prose. Politics and Prose, I was saying, was one of the few bookstores that had me read my very small novel that came out about a million years ago, and it's very nice to feel such a welcoming environment. I also have to apologize that I'm unshaven. I usually forget when I go on the road is the book that I'm supposed to be reading from, but I didn't forget that. I just forgot to bring my shaving kit, and then I was gonna rush out and get a razor, but then I was I looked at myself in the mirror with the fishing hat, and I thought, well, maybe this is a look I should kind of go with. And I kind of have made this a practice in Washington. This hat, I often lecture with this hat on. And I was actually at the Supreme Court a few years ago. You'll see in the book, there's a scene that takes place in the lawyer's room of the Supreme Court. And we were doing a thing about the Bristol Bay sockeye salmon, which I'll tell you a little bit about later. But I walked in wearing my hat with my suit, and it's sort of a security blanket. The hat, there's balding underneath, but I wear the hat, and I walked into the lawyer's room, and this very elegant older woman grabbed the brim of my hat, and she said, "What's this, young man?" I said, "It's my hat," and she went, "Humph," and I said, "Would you like me to take it off?" And she said, "Yes, I would." And I said, "Okay." And I took my hat off, and she goes, "I'm Sandra." It was Sandra Day O'Connor. So, and then, of course, standing behind me was this Alaska state senator who is a big opponent of Pebble Mine, Bristol Bay, and he looks at me and he says, "When the judge says take off your hat, you got to take off your hat." So anyway, the judge I don't think is here tonight, so I can keep my hat on, and I'll talk a little bit about the book. So who here's from New York City or has some New York roots? A little bit. You can admit it. So I'm from New York and have lived there most of my life, and this book kind of began with a kind of classic New York moment of love and real estate clashing. I had lived up until 2005 this kind of bachelor's existence in a really nice, lovely Greenwich Village apartment, which if you're not from New York, you don't realize how precious that is. You basically have to be a bond trader if you want to have a nice apartment in the West Village. But I happened to have a rent-stabilized apartment. It was very nice. I really enjoyed my bachelor life. And then, of course, I made the mistake of falling in love. The woman who I fell in love with had the real estate, and that's usually what causes somebody in New York to leave one place and trade it in for another. So I left my really beautiful, lovely West Village apartment, and I moved further and further downtown. I always thought that I lived downtown, but this was so far downtown that I remember a friend of mine named Howard Grossman, who lived in the neighborhood all the way downtown. He used to have a business card that said, "Howard Grossman, so downtown, he's uptown." So I moved so far downtown, all the way down into what I was to realize was New Amsterdam, that the original colony of New York City was at this very, very toehold of Manhattan, at the very, very end of the island of Manhattan. So I got there, and I thought, well, this is kind of an interesting place for a guy like me who really loves to fish. I grew up fishing. I grew up with seafood in my life. And I thought, well, maybe this is something that I can kind of enjoy, and I could rediscover New Amsterdam. And it could be this way of, kind of welcoming the sea into my life through this Manhattan existence. Well, I immediately found out that I was completely wrong. For the first week or two, I just kind of wandered around this really bleak neighborhood, and all there were banks and brokerage houses. And if you're a writer, generally banks and brokerage houses don't have much to do with your life. And they mostly just send you bills. So I was sort of really, really disappointed. I went over to Ground Zero. I stared into the empty pit. I went to all the bad shoe stores. There was nothing really to interest me. And then one morning I woke up very early. I'm an insomniac, and I got on my bicycle, and I decided I would kind of explore the neighborhood a little bit before dawn. And I got on my bike, and I went against traffic, and I came to a street called Maiden Lane. And I was later to learn that Maiden Lane dates from Dutch times. It used to be called de Maagdenpadje, the Maiden's Path. And it was the road along which Dutch washerwomen would go down to the East River to do their laundry. So I went down Maiden Lane, kept going, until I came to a road called Pearl Street. Dutch called it Der Pearlstraat. And I was later to find out that Pearl Street was called Pearl Street because it used to be paved with native oyster shell that was pulled out of the East River estuary. So I kept going, and I got to Water Street. And I was later to learn that Water Street used to mark the water's edge, but now it's 3 blocks from the water. Such as New York, it's this expanding beast, ever encroaching on the waterfront. And I went further and further, and I started to see images and feelings of this older New York. There were all these old Greek revival buildings from the 19th century suddenly, and I saw these old stencilings on the buildings: Joseph LaRocca and Sons, Shellfish Company, Slavin and Sons, Seafood. More and more of these sort of vestiges of what New York had been. And I kept going, and I kept going. I came to a place called Peck's Slip, and out onto South Street I came, and there in front of me was the Fulton Fish Market. And it was there, and it was amazing, and it was alive. There was such a hubbub there of whole pallets of salmon being delivered and swept away by restaurateurs. And you would also see the occasional sort of older gentleman who would sidle up to a fishmonger he'd known all his life, and he would walk away with one fillet of sole. And there was just constant bantering and hand gestures and weirdness. Anthony knows this from his past of family in the fish market business, but just an amazing, amazing live place. I mean, it was full of corruption. Word had it that you could pay up to $500 to get a monger or a trucker to move your fish from one block to the other. The city hated it. Giuliani had waged a war against it, but it was holding on by its fingernails, and it was the last waterfront market in New York City that had been in existence for close to 200 years. It had once been one of 14 waterfront markets. So I was very excited to see it. I thought, well, maybe my neighborhood isn't so bad. And I thought, well, maybe this is a chance to kind of reconnect with New York, with the waterfront. Maybe this was this alive place in this otherwise sort of dead neighborhood. So I kind of made up my mind that what I was going to do was make it a regular part of my life. And one day I did a kind of circumnavigation of New York City by bicycle. And I went up the west side, past the piers that had been saved, actually, by the Clean Water Act and by the Environmental Protection Act. Robert Moses, a huge developer, had in mind at one point to pave over the west side and create this project called Westway. And it was stopped in its tracks because they found juvenile striped bass rearing in the pilings just next to the West Side Highway. And I went up, and I rounded the tip of Manhattan down past Manhattan's last salt marsh. Manhattan used to have tens of thousands of acres of salt marsh and now has about 3. I went down and down the East River, underneath which I kind of imagine is the triple necklaces of New York, the Williamsburg, the Manhattan, and the Brooklyn Bridge. And I went further and further, really excited to look at the Fulton Fish Market, and it was gone. In the time I had last been to the fish market, the city administration had finally won the fight and once and for all got rid of the Fulton Fish Market and banished it to a far northern outpost in the Bronx in a place called Hunts Point. And I was later to go up there to Hunts Point, and I was talking to some of the old fishmongers there, and I said, how do you like it up here? He goes, this guy says to me, you know when they sent us up here, you know where they put us? Right here. And that's the way the fishmongers felt, that they'd really been exiled to a far, far corner of irrelevance of New York City. And these big, huge Italian guys, most of whom were known as, were called Bobby. There was I would go to one guy to say, hey, who's selling the cod? Well, you want to talk to Bobby. Well, who are you? Well, I'm Bobby. Well, where's the flounder? Oh, that's Bobby. So they were all named Bobby, more or less, and it was a really tough crowd. And back down in the old Fulton Fish Market, they were huge guys, and they were loomed over you. But here, up in the Bronx, they were about that big underneath this industrial space, this white, polished space that really didn't seem to need them at all. So it was right around that time that this all happened that I started to kind of think about the whole state of American seafood. And I started trolling through different data points, as one does as a journalist these days. And I came across this kind of startling statistic, which is that even though the United States actually controls more ocean than any country on Earth, more than 85% of our seafood is coming to us from abroad. Imagine that, all of that ocean, twice as many acres as we have, 2.8 billion acres of ocean, twice as many acres as we have set aside for land food, and yet more than 85% of our seafood is coming to us from abroad. And I remember when I was up at the old market, I ran into Herb Slavin, who's this famed fish market of the Fulton Market, this famed fishmonger, and I said to him, Herb, what do you think about the fact that more than 85% of our seafood is coming to us from abroad? And without skipping a beat, he goes, "Who's abroad?" And I couldn't believe how quick he made the joke. And I was like, "What?" And he goes, the lady with all the fish. Who's abroad?" So I realized that that's actually a good point. Who is the broad? What is going on with our seafood supply? So this set me into a kind of reverie and to an investigation, which basically resulted in this book. So who is the broad? Where is this massive amount of seafood that's pouring into our country? Where is it coming from? What is it? Why is it the mainstay of our seafood diet when once upon a time, not that long ago, 100 years ago, probably most of the seafood that we were eating wasn't coming from abroad? Well, number one is shrimp, okay? That's by far our most consumed seafood. The average American eats more than 4 pounds of shrimp every year. That's more than the next two, salmon and tuna combined. And a lot of us, when we think of shrimp, we think of like Bubba Gump, we think of all that kind of like local Gulf stuff. But in fact, that represents less than 10% of our shrimp supply. More than 90% of our shrimp is coming to us from abroad. And as the news starts to break, did anybody read that piece in The Guardian recently about shrimp coming from Thailand? Anybody? So in the seafood world, it was big news. So you must be really, you're following seafood. So so Thailand is by far our biggest shrimp producer. And I remember, occasionally I'd get like these requests to write articles for like Prevention magazine or like Men's Health or Women's Fitness. And, they pay pretty well, so you do it. And I was doing this prevention article and I was talking with different people about, if I was going to get really the best imported shrimp, where would I get it from? And they said, oh, Thailand. Everyone said, WWF said Thailand. All the different people I talked to said Thailand. Well, just before this book went to press, it was revealed in The Guardian that shrimp, in order to farm them, are fed ground up other little fish that are harvested throughout Southeast Asia. These are called trash fish. And it turns out that a certain portion of the crews that harvest this shrimp are slaves in Thailand, that there's a huge issue of people being impressed into slavery so that we can have an abundance of shrimp on our plates. The other thing that happened with shrimp recently was that there's a shrimp disease called early mortality syndrome. Now, I know older people in the audience might be a little worried about that. It doesn't affect people, it affects shrimp, and it actually wiped out $1 billion worth of the Thai shrimp industry last year. It's been started in China in 2007, and it's been migrating all over across Southeast Asia. So it's a really, really tough, interesting, complicated thing. So that's shrimp. That's number one. Number two is canned tuna. This was something that really came into the American consciousness in the last 40 years. It was actually Douglas MacArthur, after the end of World War II, that encouraged the Japanese to go back out to sea to fish again. And it was really the Japanese distant water fleet that established this huge tuna trade that we are now very much a part of. And so tuna is really, really in our lives. And again, the vast majority of the tuna that we are eating is coming to us from abroad. Number three is salmon. And you would think the United States would have a lot of its own salmon. And we do, because who here has ever been to Alaska? All right, it's a pretty good amount. And when you go to like Seattle, everyone's like, yeah, I've been to Alaska. They're very bored about it. But I mean, it's a very exciting place to go, especially if you're like a fishy guy. And especially like right now, I often think of salmon as my fish, particularly sockeye salmon. I'm born on the 4th of July. And the peak of the biggest sockeye salmon run left on Earth is the 4th of July. So it's always very exciting for me to go. Anyway, just millions and millions and millions of pounds of salmon caught in Alaska every year. Where does it go? Abroad. 80% of the Alaska salmon catch gets sent abroad, and in return, we import about 2/3 of our salmon that we eat is farmed and coming to us mostly from Chile. And it's interesting because salmon are not even native to the southern hemisphere. In fact, there are so many salmon farmed in Chile at this point that they're considered an invasive species because they escape and get into southern rivers. Meanwhile, though, if you want like the really weirdest thing of all about the American salmon supply is that a certain portion, and we don't really know because it's really hard to kind of find these statistics, but a certain portion of the American Alaska salmon catch gets caught in Alaska waters, frozen, sent to China, defrosted, boned, filleted, and then sent back to America double frozen. So, and it was funny, I was on Terry Gross the other day, and she goes, well, my mother said that you're not supposed to freeze meat twice. And I was like, Terry, my mom said the same thing. And it's an interesting question. Why is that happening? And it's not just happening with salmon. It's happening with our squid. Like you can go to Santa Barbara, for example, and go to a seaside restaurant, and you're going to order a nice plate of calamari. That squid is very likely to have been caught in Oxnard or Ventura or somewhere near Santa Barbara, but it would have been frozen at sea, sent to China, cut up, made into rings, and sent back to you to get back to your plate in Santa Barbara. There's a Russian joke where you say somebody says to somebody, can you show me where your ear is? And he says, oh yeah, sure, it's over here. And that's kind of to me like where's your squid? Your squid's over here. So it's a very, very confusing, strange system. So that's salmon is number 3. Number 4, most consumed seafood in America is tilapia. Sometimes it's pollock, sometimes it's tilapia. 4 and 5 bounce around. They compete with each other. So tilapia is one of these seafoods that, who here has eaten tilapia at one time or another? Right? So if I'd asked this question 20 years ago, nobody would have raised their hands. In fact, actually, I talked to an aquaculture guy who said to me the first time he heard the word tilapia, he thought it was a stomach disease. And maybe you've gotten a stomach disease from them, but it's not a stomach disease. Tilapia are actually a fairly environmentally sound fish. They go from egg to adult in about 9 months, which is very, very quick compared to like a salmon, which takes a couple of years. They were actually spread around the world by Peace Corps volunteers to some degree, because Peace Corps volunteers, when they would go to developing nations, they would see these protein-deprived countries, and they would find that if you threw a few tilapia into the stagnant, murky pond, the tilapia would eat whatever is in there, turn it into protein, and then poof, you've got yourself a real good source of protein. Americans didn't like that at first, obviously. If you raise a fish in a murky pond, it gets this thing called off flavor. And that's actually a term in the seafood industry. The seafood industry is all full of really fun terms like off flavor and twice frozen, things like that really fly below the radar. But off flavor is actually a real problem in the freshwater fish farming industry. In fact, in the catfish farming industry in the American South, there's actually remember there was that show on TV called like Worst Jobs, or like Horrible Jobs? I can't remember what the show was. Well, so worst job by far in the American South is this job called a catfish taster. And the catfish taster, basically, catfish are really hardy, and you can seine them up and put them in the back of your pickup truck, and they flop around, and you take them to the plant, and then they fillet one, and they bring it to the catfish taster, and she's usually a she, as happens in these sort of situations. She microwaves a cube of it, and she puts it in her mouth, and then she kind of chews, and she says, y'all, that catfish is off. And if the catfish is off, they don't bother slaughtering the rest of the catfish. They're flopping around the back of the truck. They send them back to the pond, dump them back in the pond. They swim around until the algal bloom passes, and they no longer have off flavor. So anyway, digression, that's a problem that they used to have with tilapia, but over the years, they've worked out that off flavor situation. And so now China, the largest tilapia producer by far, is sending us tons and tons and tons and tons of it. Interestingly enough, going in the other direction is another American fish that probably you haven't heard of, which is called the Alaska or walleye pollock. Anybody ever heard of that fish? Like a few hands, right? Actually, no. I had an op-ed in the Times a few weeks ago, and then my partner, who's a huge crossword puzzle fan, it was a clue in the crossword puzzle. I was like, wow, if I penetrated the culture that much, that something from my op-ed made it into a crossword puzzle. So it was very exciting to see that. But So pollock is this sort of invisible, visible fish. It is the fish in your filet of fish sandwich. It is the fish in your fake crab. The crab that, remember, in I think one of the later episodes of Curb Your Enthusiasm, Larry David, when he's breaking up with his wife complains that he talks about nonsense things during sex, and he always talks about fake crab during sex. Anyway, the fake crab is Alaska pollock. So that's a huge, huge fishery. It's by far the largest finfish fishery in the United States. You're talking billions of pounds that we catch, but we send 600 million pounds of pollock every year abroad, often to Asia, and in return, we get tilapia. So we're sending this wild stuff abroad, and in return, we get the farm stuff. The other farmed whitefish, and another funny industry term, like the seafood industry has this term whitefish. We, like Anthony and I, know whitefish really is a sort of a smoked thing that you would have on a bagel. No, the seafood industry has canceled that. Whitefish is any mutable, white-fleshed chunk of stuff that you can turn into a stick or throw on a bun. And it's sort of like somebody in the seafood industry said to me that most of America thinks of seafood as a dough delivery system. So whitefish is the ultimate dough delivery system. Very little nutrition. In fact, tilapia are, a lot of people eat seafood to get their omega-3s. Who here eats seafood primarily to get their omega-3s? Oh, a few. Okay. That crowd, I know. This is like the omega center is right there. So they eat their omega. But tilapia don't actually offer you very much in the way of omega-3s. In fact, some say they have the dreaded omega-6. Oh no! Talk about early mortality syndrome. The omega-6, is more typical of land foods like pork and chicken and beef. So you're not getting your omega-6 when you eat tilapia. So that's one of these whitefish swaps that's going on. Another whitefish swap that goes on is number 6, which is the fish you've never heard of, called the Pangasius catfish. So this is the 6th most consumed fish in America, and nobody knows about it. Some people know about it, but very few. Sometimes it's called swai, sometimes it's called tra, sometimes it's called basa, and it actually has all these names because the catfish farmers in America sued Vietnam because the Vietnam catfish, they were calling catfish. And while it looks vaguely like a catfish, calling that fish a catfish, it would be sort of like if you went to the meat section and instead of saying, beef, pork, lamb, it just said hoofed mammal. So that's sort of like what the grounds were. So of course the catfish farmers sued. They changed the name to basa and tra, which are two different species there, and then they changed it again to swai. But this fish, nevertheless, no matter how many times they change the name, our appetite for this fish just grows and grows and grows. So this fish you probably most often come across it, say, in a hospital. Not because it put you in the hospital, but you're in the hospital, and you're sort of sitting there. Your appendix has just been taken out, and the orderly comes by and says, "What would you like for lunch? Chicken or fish?" And you're like, "What's the fish?" "I don't know. It's fish." And so that's going to be swai or Pangasius catfish. So this fish is really interesting because I've been to the swai ponds of Vietnam. It was like my Heart of Darkness trip. And I went there, and these fish are so stacked in these ponds that it kind of looks like an M.C. Escher painting. Like they're sort of tail over tail and head over tail, and they go up and up and up, and they're really, really stacked in there. And the amazing thing is that, you would think, wow, with so many fish in this pond, aren't they going to run out of oxygen? And they do. And when they run out of oxygen, they stick their weird little faces above the water, and they take a breath. They can breathe air. So it's one of the reasons that these fish are so incredibly productive. It's a very weird scene. If you want to know more about the Pangasius catfish, I wrote a piece for the Times Magazine a few years ago called "A Catfish by Any Other Name," and goes into it to some greater detail. So anyway, those are our top 6. Those are our top 6 seafoods. The majority of, it's 12 out of the 15 pounds of seafood that we Americans eat. Compared, and I should point out, 100 years ago, the average New Yorker ate 36 pounds of seafood per year. Now we eat about 15. Compare that to land food. And by the way, I'm going to trying to throw a meme out into the world with land food, because if ever you're going to call thousands of species that range the gamut across phyla, you can call it all seafood. Then I'm going to call everything from land, I'm going to call it land food, no hyphen, no space. So We eat over 200 pounds of land food meat a year compared to 15 pounds of seafood. And I harken back again, the country that controls the most ocean of any country on Earth. And this compared to, we're actually well below other countries, China, Japan, Korea, all places, I might add, that have pretty high test scores, pretty low levels of obesity. See a correlation here? They all eat 2 to 3 times as much seafood as we eat. So, makes you think about the national consciousness. I mean, I actually had coffee with Michael Pollan the other day, and we were talking about our respective dilemmas. My dilemma, his success. And his success is that, he basically he has all of food. He has land food. And I was telling him how, like, in the last chapter of Nominore's Dilemma, when he briefly contemplates going fishing, I was in the middle of writing 4 fish. I was like, no, Michael, don't go fishing. Please, don't go. Leave the fish to me. And he was like, he left the fish for me. But, it's kind of a national mission to steal Michael's readers because, we should be eating more fish and you should be buying more fish books to compensate for Michael's sale. So it's just a $29.95. Anyway, so with all that in mind, I set out to write this book. And all of this is a little bit kind of preamble. It's all in the introduction. But I'll sum up a little bit about what goes on in the rest of the book, and you guys can delve into it to a greater degree. So I mentioned at the top of the talk that shrimp was by far our most consumed seafood. Well, once upon a time, this guy, the eastern oyster, was our most consumed seafood by far. This country, up until about 1920, produced 2 billion pounds of oysters every year, and our per capita consumption of oysters was equal to what our per capita of shrimp is today. So a total, I always like to say we swapped half shells for cocktails. And it's a really, really big ecological paradigm shift. Because when you think about it, where do oysters grow? Oysters grow in estuaries. Where are our cities in this country? Primarily on top of estuaries. I was thinking as I was taking the Acela down from New York, every single place I was passing, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Wilmington, these are all estuaries upon which were filled with tons and tons of oysters. So our, St. Petersburg, they said, Pushkin said was built on the bones of peasants. Our cities are built on the bones of oysters. City after city, we've undermined our oyster populations, and this has done really serious damage to our fish populations. We've lost something like 80% of our wild oyster reefs through a combination of all different things: pollution, overharvest, even just sort of municipal sewage that continues to grow each and every day and each and every year. We are losing estuary by estuary. And it's sort of interesting when I talk to different biologists about what oysters can give us. They do tremendous things for our seafood supply. Oyster restoration projects, and there are some going around, many going around in the Chesapeake, a lot going on in the deep South, and even some going on in New York City. And you'll see when you read the book, the whole structure of the oyster chapter is about the attempt to try and restore oysters to New York City. And I even went so far as to eat a New York City oyster. And I'm still here to talk about it. But I wouldn't recommend it. As I said on an interview recently, I'm a professional writer. Please don't try this at home. I will take that risk for you. But in any case, biologists who look at oysters and what they can do for an ecosystem have found that a restored oyster reef can double the fish populations in a given piece of water. And I remember there's one guy who's head of the East Coast Shellfish Growers Association. He wrote to me that in Rhode Island, when he started his shellfish farm in 1981, he said to me, we had a chunk of anoxic, black, horrible bottom. Within 3 years of starting our oyster farm, it had become the most popular scuba diving site in Rhode Island, full of lobsters, full of striped bass, just full of life. So, there's a lot of sadness in this book, but I think that there is a core of hope, which is we can restore oysters. It's worked in many, many places. It's moving forward in many places. I should note, however, that in New Jersey, they tried to get oysters restored in the New Jersey side of New York Harbor, and it was going really well until the Christie administration came in and the new DEC ripped the oysters out of Keyport Harbor and threw them in the garbage. Christie denies any connection to that, of course. he was busy closing a bridge, but actually but meanwhile on the New York side of the harbor, we're really starting to see oysters coming back. There's an amazing organization called the New York Harbor School, and they've started a project called the Billion Oyster Project, and the goal is to get 1 billion oysters into the harbor by 2035, and so far we've got 1 million. And it's a really amazing project, and if you're in New York, check it out. And by the way, is the buck oyster special kind of starting to make an appearance in Washington, D.C.? Can you go to a happy hour and get an oyster for $1 or less? So, that's the direct result of the Clean Water Act. In 1972, oyster production in this country was at 1% of historical capacity. Now we're at 14% of historical capacity. So we're on an upswing, and it's because we have clean water. My friend Carl Safina said to me, one of the reasons that conservatives want to get rid of the Clean Water Act is because they don't remember how dirty the water was. Anyone who is born, I think, before 1950 can remember the horrible, horrible situation we had with water in this country, the Cuyahoga River catching on fire, the just incredible amount of pollution. And that has largely, I don't know if it's been solved, but it's certainly been addressed. And that's a kind of a through line through this book is the Clean Water Act. So anyway, so that's that's oysters, and that's sort of the first opening part of the book. The next part is I looked at shrimp, and I told you a little bit about what's been going on there. But I started out, actually, the real reason that this book came to be was that when I first started working on this book, Four Fish came out, and much to my amazement, it did really well. It was a bestseller. It was very exciting. And then, of course, if a writer ever has any success, you get into a talismanic state. It's like, how can I do exactly the same thing again? So immediately my publishers were like, well, could you write another fish book? And I was like, okay, I can write another fish book. Well, at the time that Four Fish came out, the Gulf oil spill had just happened. And I always like to say that I'm the only person who benefited from the Gulf oil spill. When Four Fish came out, everybody wanted to talk about the ocean. Suddenly, the ocean. Oh, let's talk about the ocean. And meanwhile, there was not a scrap about the Gulf of Mexico in Four Fish. But, there I was with Terry Gross. So tell me about the Gulf oil spill. And I had to kind of ad-lib it. I didn't really know what was going on. So so after Four Fish came out, I sold a book to my publisher called Under the Horizon. Because remember, there was the Deepwater Horizon. And so I was going to write this book about the oil spill and track it for a number of years. So right after I sold the book, then, of course, like millions of oil spill books came out. There was Over the Horizon, Beyond the Horizon, Shadows on the Gulf, Beyond the Gulf, Save the Gulf. And I ran into my friend Carl Safina, who's a great writer, MacArthur Genius guy. And he had just written a book called, A Sea in Flames, also about the Gulf oil spill. And I was like, Carl, so I got this, advance to write the Gulf oil spill book. And he goes, don't do it. I was like, what? No, don't do it. The scientists are all caught up in litigation. We won't know what's going to happen for years. Don't write the freaking oil spill book. You'll regret it. So meanwhile, I already had this contract, and I went down to the Gulf, and I was like on an all-night shrimping thing with this guy, shrimping and shrimping and shrimping. And it was getting more and more depressing, and he was talking about the spill. But then at a certain point, he stopped talking about the spill. There was this kind of weird pretense, like I was there ostensibly for the spill. He had invited me on board ostensibly because of the spill, and we were having this sort of fake conversation about the spill. And everybody was talked out about the spill. They really didn't want to talk about it anymore. And then this long silence ensued, and at a certain point, he turned to me, he goes, the real problem is all the shrimp coming from Asia. And I was like, wow. Really? And then we sparked this whole dialogue. So that's what the shrimp chapter is really about. It's about this tussle between the Gulf on the one side, which, by the way, is in real danger from the oil industry, but not really necessarily from the spill. The oil industry has been active in the Mississippi Delta for years, since the 1920s. And they've actually canalized all of the marshes so that salt water is inundating this actual shrimp rearing ground, the engine that makes all that Gulf shrimp for us. And we're now losing the Mississippi Delta at a rate of about a football field an hour. It's kind of, amazing statistic. And we're not seeing it. We're not noticing it. We're not seeing this disappearance precisely because that alarm is being masked by the presence of all this really cheap farm shrimp coming to us from Asia. So I won't go into too much detail. There's a whole history of farmed shrimp, how it came to us in result because of a dish called dancing shrimp, which was a Japanese specialty where you take a live shrimp, you rip off its carapace, dip it in sake, and pop it in your mouth while it's still wriggling, and that's called dancing shrimp, and that's why we have so much shrimp available today, thanks to the dancing shrimp. So that's the shrimp portion of it. And then the last portion of it, and I always say that, like, so my books are typically divided up into 3 or 4 chunks. And I always say it's sort of like, remember in college when your professor said, I'm going to talk to you today about 4 things. And then you're just like, when the 4th thing finally comes along, you're like, oh, thank God, we have to reach the 4th. So anyway, we reached the 3rd thing. There's only 3 things in this book. But we reached the 3rd thing. And the last thing I talk about is sockeye salmon in Alaska. So if New York oysters represent the past of our seafood and shrimp really represent the struggles going on right now, what's going on in Alaska really represents the future and future decisions about our seafood supply. Alaska is orders of magnitude bigger in terms of supplying our seafood than any other state. And in fact, what we've seen in our seafood supply, the seafood that we do have, a lot of it is coming to us from Alaska. The Big Mac used to be made out of Atlantic cod, and now it's made out of Alaska pollock. It's a huge, huge swap. But right now, the very infrastructure of Alaska that is producing all of this seafood is being challenged and being threatened. Alaska has something like 1/8 of the world's coal reserves tied up in there, and God knows if we take out all of that coal, what we'll be left with. And in addition, it also has a lot of minerals, copper and gold in particular. And so I focus in on the last chapter on Bristol Bay, which is a fight I've been really fighting for a long time. That's what led me to meet Sandra Day O'Connor. In fact, Sandra Day O'Connor turns out to be a huge fisherman. And I always like to say there's an expression in Russian which is rybak rybaka vidится издалека, which means a fisherman can spot another fisherman from far away. And I always like to think that even in Washington, it's like they're hidden moles. People who fish, they find each other out. And if you want to know how to really cross party lines, just get a couple of fishermen together talking about these really, really critical issues. And so, Sandra Day O'Connor really represents to me the kind of bull moose Republican, the kind of Republican that had, when you think about the word conservative, and conservation, they're the same root. And there was an element within the Republican Party that really saw conserving our natural resources and our natural wealth as kind of key to national security. So a lot of these people, thank you, a lot of these people are kind of don't know what quite to do about this whole Bristol Bay situation. Because what's going on now is that a concern called the Pebble Partnership would like to cite the largest copper and gold mine atop, more or less, the largest sockeye salmon run left in the world. Talking like 40 million fish come into this system every year. Now, this copper and gold mine is so huge that it really almost defies imagination. We're talking about 10 billion tons of ore that would have to be extracted from the site. The site is largely sulfurous ore, so all that would be exposed to air and water and could contaminate the system. There are no roads outside of this area, and this guy, Rick Halford, who is this former Republican state senator who used to say that he'd never met a mining project he didn't like. When he saw Pebble, he was like, whoa, this is really something out of the ordinary. Anyway, he flew me over on his little plane. He's odd man. He claims to have taught himself how to fly, which I'm not quite sure how you do that, but that's very Alaskan. Most Alaskans I know have built their own house. They just know how to do things in Alaska that we've just sort of let vestigially, drop away. But Rick was flying me over the Pebble Strike, and he said, you see that mountain over there? Well, that's where they would have to attach one dam, and we'd have to go all the way to that mountain, and then back this way. And he basically mapped out this geographic sweep of territory, all that would sit right next to this amazing, beautiful salmon run. So right now, we're actually on the verge of maybe not having that happen. Thanks to the first time of sport fishermen and commercial fishermen coming together in Alaska in a really big way, there's a section of the Clean Water Act called a 404C clause, which basically allows the EPA to step in, even in areas of state jurisdiction, if there is a spawning grounds, a shellfish grounds of national significance at risk by industrialization. And the very, very first steps of a 404C action have started in Bristol Bay, and it really looks that possibly this mine could be stopped, and that for the first time, a fishery is recognized as having huge national significance and really critical to the health and to the health, the mental health, the physical health of the nation. So, I try to end on something of an upbeat tone. So I thought I would end here in the official, formal discussion, and I will take some questions later, with just a little section from towards the end of the book. I was up in Bristol Bay fishing with a group of called the Iliamna Fishing Company, and it's a small group of guys from Brooklyn and Portland. Strange sort of hipster convergence where they're actually native Athabascan Indians, and they own a salmon lease in this place called Graveyard Point. And I went fishing with them, and they package their catch separately and sell it in what's called a community-supported fishery that you can actually buy a membership in. Get for a couple $100 a year, you get a regular delivery of salmon throughout the year. It's a really, really amazing thing. So anyway, I was fishing with them and had a little reflection as I was sitting there in this sort of bombed-out former cannery. It's called Graveyard Point because it was where actually the graveyard of the Norwegian cannery used to be. And occasionally, out of the cliff face, buried bodies will pop out of the cliff face. It's a very strange place, but also very beautiful and magical, and sort of in its own way very special. So I'm up there, and I'll just read this little section. To eat from dry land, we humans are compelled to tame the countryside, till and fertilize it, kill off pests and fence off territory, to grind and process and flavor, add nutrients, subtract fat, shape and mold until that increasingly artificial land food becomes something not quite food. At sea, everything is a miracle by comparison. All that the sea asks of us is that we be wise in our harvest, recognize the limits of its bounty, and protect the places where seafood wealth is born. In return, the sea will feed us and make us smarter, healthier, and more resilient. Quite a covenant. With dinner stowed away, I took a walk around the old cannery grounds of Graveyard Point while the polar sun circled in the nightless summer sky. This was a place where industrial fishing had once turned a dynamic wild animal into a faceless commodity product that traveled the world in a can. I thought of the particularly contemporary American reworking of those bad times that was happening here today. A small group of committed artisan fishermen doing something very different. A group that fished modestly, followed the rules, caught what could be sustained, and formed their own pact with American fish eaters to the south. Fish eaters who wanted to know what they were eating, how it was caught, and how the people who caught it led their lives. Passing up to a bluff, I looked down on the isolated little settlement washed by the foam of the Bering Sea, and thought that once upon a time, a little 17th century fishing village called New Amsterdam must have looked quite a bit like this. A modest place with its face turned toward the sea, where the fisherman and the fishmonger were an integral part of daily life, and where seafood held its own with land food in every regard. What kind of alternate future might America have had if the descendants of New Amsterdam had decided that seafood, not land food, would be the new country's bread and butter? Not a Jeffersonian society that relied upon the harvests of agriculture, not a Hamiltonian one that captained banking and industry, but rather a Neptunian democracy that lived off the sea. A place where estuaries were recognized as the heart of the food system, where rivers were rarely fettered for fear of impeding the miraculous runs of salmon, sturgeon, shad, and herring, where human development moved in parallel with the protection of the near shore. What kind of society might we have formed had we not, as Melville wrote in Moby Dick, become, quote, landsmen, tied to counters, nailed to benches, clinched to desks? What if instead we had become what Melville called a society fixed in ocean reveries? Thank you very much. So I went on a little long there, but if people want to ask a question or two, I'm happy to answer any questions. And you can also go off topic and talk about any seafood besides oyster, shrimp, and salmon. Yes?
So could you tell us a little bit about cod?
Yeah.
And what's happened to cod? Why is it so hard to find fresh cod here? When we go to the Main Avenue fish market, there is fresh cod there, but where's that from?
Yeah, excellent question. What has happened to cod? Who here has read Mark Kurlansky's great book, Cod? Classic. Really got me in this racket. Cod used to be largely from the Atlantic Canada and the northeast of the United States, Georges Bank being the most famous codfish grounds that we had. We overfished those grounds really, really severely. Sort of an interesting sidebar is that one of the reasons we control so much ocean in this country is that after World War II, nations of the world made a grab for more ocean. And in 1976, this country unilaterally declared a 200-mile exclusive economic zone, extending our territorial holdings out from 10 miles to 200 miles. And suddenly what I think happened within the Department of the Navy, people were like, guys, if we're going to have all this more new ocean, we're going to need to put something out there to control it. And the Navy was like, fishermen. So this huge buildup of fishing effort, this overfishing that happened in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s is a large part result from trying to figure out how to claim all of that ocean. We subsidized fishing beyond what was reasonable. We gave tax breaks. We allowed people to amortize the value of their vessels really quickly. And that cod really felt the brunt of it. But to your question, where is the cod in the market coming from? Well, believe it or not, Alaska actually has a lot of cod too. It's a different species. It's a Pacific cod, so you'll often see it in the marketplace. And the other thing, which is a kind of testament to good fisheries management, Norway and Iceland actually have excellent fisheries management in place right now. And there's kind of more Barents Sea cod off of Norway than they know what to do with at this point. So a huge amount of cod is coming to us from Norway at this point. Yes?
Excuse me, but if it's coming from Norway, wouldn't it be frozen?
Yes, it is most likely from.
This is supposed to be fresh.
You know, the fresh frozen thing, it's a big, debate. I mean, I always go, when I go to Whole Foods sometimes, and I love the guys at Whole Foods, they have really good fish policies. But how many times have you gone to like Whole Foods in March and you see fresh sockeye salmon from Alaska? It's there on ice. They don't catch sockeye salmon in March. That's been frozen and defrosted and put out there. Chilean sea bass, fresh Chilean sea bass. Oh, really? How did you get that from the Southern Ocean? You know, where it's like a 10-day sail from the nearest point of land. How did you get that fresh? So I don't really trust a lot of this fresh frozen thing. Sometimes you'll see the term fresh frozen. In other words, if you freeze something really quickly, the ice crystals that form in the flesh form more quickly than they do if you freeze it slowly. And if you have small ice crystals, it doesn't rupture the cell wall of the fish, and so it doesn't get mushy, and it might appear more fresh. But the chances of getting a truly fresh cod, minimal, I would say, unless it's coming from New England. And there is some New England cod, but not a lot. Yes?
Could you say something about commercial fish and shrimp farms? I mean, a lot of people that do eat fish, they do so because it's considered to be healthy, lean, protein.
Yeah.
And what about in these commercial farming operations with this high concentration? Don't they use a lot of chemicals as disease preventatives because the outbreaks are so devastating if they happen? So who's monitoring the true healthfulness of this stuff that's coming in from the outside? They're not checking every fish or every lot or anything.
Yeah,
you want to say something?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge issue. Huge issue. The FDA is only able to inspect about 2% of all the seafood that comes into this country, which is troublesome because seafood in general ranks among the highest for FDA violations. So we're only checking 2%. Something like 25% of the food violations that come through usually have to do with seafood. There are some places like Whole Foods that is careful about the chain of custody in that they have direct relationships with individual farms that they audit and they inspect. But the vast majority is very, very hard to figure out what's going on. There are tens of thousands of shrimp farms in Southeast Asia. How do you inspect them all? You know, same with Pangasius farms. I was there with a few years ago with WWF was trying to come up with this thing called a standard called the Aquaculture Stewardship Council. At the time, it was called the Aquaculture Dialogues. A little boring, but that's the world I inhabit. But I sat in on some of these aquaculture dialogues, and the best they could come up with would be that the best producers come up with standards that they somehow enforce amongst the other producers. It's a really question of that. Remember that Latin phrase, "Who watches the watchers?" We really don't know, and that's why I actually think, I'm a big fan of wild fish, but if we need to, I'm not against having aquaculture in this country. But currently, the United States is 15th in aquaculture production, just behind Myanmar and Egypt. So, talk about an issue of national priority that we could get on. To me, that's a big issue. Yes?
I saw a rather troubling documentary recently about farm salmon in British Columbia, which are fed GMO corn, loaded up with antibiotics, and artificial astaxanthin to make them color
red.
Pink.
Yeah.
And, a huge number of them had leukemia, and this is before harvesting them. So I guess my question is there any farm fish that you would eat, and where can you find it? Or would you just not even deal with farm fish?
I mean, the fact of the matter is if we want to eat fish, we're going to have to eat some farm fish. It's just we don't. If the world is going to have their 2 portions of fish that the USDA says we should have, you run the numbers. There's just going to be 100 million, or no, it's going to be we'll be 100 million tons short. So we have to have aquaculture. My first and favorite thing is, as far as aquaculture is concerned, is farmed clams, mussels, and oysters, because particularly if we can get them domestically, the way they exist is by processing algae. You don't have to feed them anything. And a lot of people don't know this, but a mussel, great seafood, has as many omega-3s as a tuna, and none of the mercury. So that I would eat as a farm product. Farmed salmon, it's one of those things where it's like the bagel and the salmon inevitably meet in situations where you don't have full control over the situation. So I will eat the salmon when it comes across my plate, because if it's going to get thrown out, I'd rather just be the sort of human disposal bin for it. There are producer, we actually do not have an organic standard for farmed fish in this country. So if you see organic farmed fish, it's kind of a misnomer. They do have organic standards in Scotland, in portions of Europe. There's a great salmon producer in Scotland called Loch Duart. It does a really, really nice product, and you'll sometimes see it in the market here. I do think that the salmon industry is trying harder to be better. And frankly, if you were to compare them head to head with like the beef industry, the poultry industry, the pork industry, I don't necessarily think they would stack up so badly, because already, what's getting fed to cows? Antibiotic-laced corn, GMO corn, so like why suddenly do we have this? I think the reason we have this objection to farm fish is because it's the last wild food. It's a thing that we are expecting to be pure. So if we go into any kind of mass farming system, we're going to have these situations come up. But I would also argue that in this country, aquaculturists often will say, we need to have farmed fish. And yes, the world needs farmed fish. But when you think about it, the United States exports a third of what we catch. 3 billion pounds of fish we export every single year. All of the black cod, almost. Lovely dish that you might have had at Nobu if you're lucky enough to go there. Tons and tons of lobster, tons and tons of really great American seafood gets exported. So before we launch into a giant aquaculture program, I think the first step is to figure out, like, how can we keep more American seafood at home and use that to make ourselves healthy? And then if we still need aquaculture, then let's do aquaculture. So, yes.
Hi. Whenever I hear about environmental issues or food, feed, fodder issues, I think, okay, so what can we do? And you've touched a little bit on this. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Anyway, I own a young oyster company. And we provide oysters. So I don't know if you recognize me as a fisherman. Maybe not.
You're all dolled up tonight.
Because I'm an oysterman. But anyway, one thing that we look into is how to use aquaculture to fix our waterways. Not that you can fix them, but as you know, we have too many nutrients in our waterways.
Yep.
And you can actually use some kinds of aquaculture to extract those nutrients.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you've considered a book on that, and if so, we'd be very interested in collaborating. I think it's an area that should be looked at more closely and figure out how to use the tools that we have with our waterways in the situation that they are.
So when I get my MacArthur Genius Grant, I will definitely write a book about that. Unfortunately, I have to work with the market a little bit. But no, seriously, it's there are many huge environmental projects and things out there that really need more attention. But what can you use to grab the public imagination? I've tried in this book, in the first third, is really a lot about shellfish aquaculture, and I do talk a lot about that aspect of shellfish aquaculture, that, the average oyster can filter 50 gallons of water a day. Imagine what New York City was like when we had trillions and trillions of oysters in the estuary. It turned the entire water column over every few weeks. That's amazing. There are even better filter feeders out there, which I'm sure you're aware of, like, not quite filter feeders, but edible kelps and seaweeds. A lot of people think that this is the food of the 21st century. This also requires no fertilizer whatsoever, no inputs. And what it does is it takes all the excess nitrogen and phosphorus that's running off of agricultural fields and sewage systems, goes into the water. They turn it into food. And even if it's growing in polluted waterways where you couldn't technically eat them, seaweeds actually are useful in all sorts of things, from biopharmaceuticals to cosmetics to all these kinds of things. So there's a huge project. There's a great guy. Do you know Bren Smith and the Thimble Island Oyster Company? So Bren he's a great promoter of these things, and he actually has a great TED Talk called The Least Dangerous Catch, which is worth taking a look at. But Bren has sort of, we need to rebrand these things. And shellfish aquaculture and seaweeds are older than many civilizations. But how do we reboot them? And so Bran has called it 3D ocean farming, or the least dangerous catch. We need to, as a society, invent ways to make people understand that these really should be the core of our seafood system.
So if you told a farmer that he or she could have a free product, you don't need seeds, you don't need fertilizers, and it grows on its own, they'd say, wow, I want to do that kind of farming.
Sign me up, exactly.
And seaweed farming is exactly that.
Exactly
so
that.
Thanks for mentioning.
And Bren claims that he's been doing using kelp to actually feed cattle, which I think, well, listen, not that we need more cattle, but it's an interesting thing. He said the chefs actually love the taste of kelp-grazed cattle because they have a lot of umami. So it was good. Yes?
Yes, you mentioned lobster among the products that U.S. is exporting, but you didn't include lobster in the book.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, there's so many fish in the sea. The way I've structured this book and the last book is that I look at each example as kind of the top of a pyramid that hopefully leads you into an investigation of larger things. It's a matter of time and a matter of focus. I find that the average American can read about 180 pages of a fish book before they move on to their James Patterson novel. So I'm trying to hold the attention as much as I can. The nice thing about going on tour, and also I have a whole outreach program around this book that's launching in the fall, where we're going to 9 different fishing communities and doing workshops around the local seafood in each community. The nice thing is that you can explore these things. Lobster, though, I'll say a few words that I think are really interesting. Lobster, as you know, are caught in pots, traps, and they're relatively unobtrusive fishing gear, and a lot of people think of it as a really good example of sustainable fishing, and I wouldn't argue with them mostly. But one thing that's really striking is that I hear a Slavic accent in your voice, right? So you're must be fond of herring. Potentially, it's in your culture. So herring is not in this culture. Selyotka. It's a delicious, high omega-3, low pollutant fish. It's an amazing, amazing fish. Something like 3/4 of the main herring catch goes into lobster traps. And something like 1 million pounds of sardines and anchovies that we catch in this country gets used for bait. Why is that? There's millions of illogical things like this in our seafood supply, and it has to do with our, constant desire to eat elite things. Once lobster got branded as this international elite product that everybody wanted to have, it made a name for itself in the world. And so we're sending tons and tons of Maine lobster abroad that's fed on herring that we could be eating. So, for a planet that's going to have 9 billion people, I think we really need to take a look at some of these practices. I'm not against the lobster industry. I think we should have it. I think it's a great product. I love to go to the shore and eat a lobster. But I don't need to eat 15 lobsters a year, and neither does the rest of the world, I think. Yes?
Time for the last 2.
Okay, last 2 questions. Yes?
I have to admit I've eaten a dancing shrimp.
How was it?
It was terrible.
Oh.
I have a question about bycatch, especially when it comes to tuna, and unless tuna's caught on the line, right? And I'm just wondering if you get into issues around bycatch, because that's one of the biggest environmental impacts of catching wild seafood is everything that's lost in the process.
That's right. Bycatch is a huge issue. I do get into bycatch issues in the shrimp chapter. Again, part for the whole synecdoche, I guess it's called. And shrimp is, in a way, the worst example of bycatch. In bad shrimp fisheries, poorly regulated shrimp fisheries, it can be as many as 8 or even 10 pounds of other stuff killed for 1 pound of shrimp. In good fisheries, they get it down to about 2 to 1, but that's still a lot. And I think, the bycatch rates in this country range, sometimes 20%, sometimes 50%. It's a huge issue. And actually, when you get into the questions of aquaculture, and if you really dig deep into it, one thing people will always raise is many fish need to be fed fish to be raised on a farm. And it's called the FIFA, the fish in, fish out ratio. This is the world I live in. I dream about FIFA. But so, people will, in the early days of salmon aquaculture, it could take as many as 6 pounds of wild fish to produce a pound of salmon. So you think, wow, that sucks. I mean, what a terrible situation. But then you look at bycatch and shrimp, and 6 pounds of stuff are killed to get you your pound of salmon. So this is a kind of an equalizer. And, there are many ways to be better at bycatch and fishing industries. Again, it's like we need to think about our fishing industry. We need to think about all the technologies that are out there that could help us have more efficient and better fisheries. There's all sorts of stuff, smart applications that could be used to building better nets, better sonar, species separation, all these kinds of things, but we don't think about it. And we really should. And I do think that there is a way to achieve stability with our marine resources and with the way we harvest it. I don't think we have to go all farmed, but we have to think about it and we have to invest in it. We have cut so much money from NOAA, from National Marine Fisheries Service, all in the name of a streamlined economy. But in order to have good fisheries, you need to have good management. You need to have good managers. And surprise, you have to pay somebody to stand on a freaking pollock trawler in the Bering Sea. And if we're not willing to do it, then we shouldn't be allowed to eat seafood. Yes, last question.
Hi. So I'm wondering, what the average consumer, particularly a consumer who's, not too knowledgeable about seafood terms, what he or she can do to, consciously support local American fishermen. Are there any grocers or any buzzwords that we should look for in doing that? So
the best thing you could do is to join what's called a community-supported fishery, and there's a website called localcatch.org. And you can sign up for it. Mid-Atlantic is not so strong on it yet, but write to the organizers and see if you can get it going. But there are fair amount of them in the Southeast and the Northeast and the West Coast. Short of that, you should ask your fishmonger and even your supermarket fish department, where the least knowledgeable people on earth tend to congregate. As the guy in the Bronx said to me up at the Fulton Market, he said, the problem with the seafood today used to be the wives, they went to the store, they talked to us, we told them what was good, they bought it, and everybody was happy. Now the wives, they go to the counter, the guy came over there from Deli Meats, he doesn't know anything, and they buy some crappy piece of fish, they take it home, everyone hates it, they never eat fish again. So, so you kind of got to put your fishmonger on the spot. We need better fish labeling in this country. We need to at least know where it's from. And the crazy thing about this, the re-export and re-import thing I told you about, in this country, the way the laws work, if you catch a fish in America, you export it to China, process it, and re-import it, it's labeled product of China, even though it was American. Same thing here. If we take a foreign fish, comes over here, and we reprocess it and then send it away, it's called product of the USA. We need better traceability. And we need to, frankly, I know maybe I'll get a call from the Chinese embassy, but I think we need to disentangle our food system from China. In 2007, China executed the head of its FDA. Executed. Bullet to the back of the head. Because he took bribes and tainted the food system and put poison milk onto the market. Is that a food system that we should be involved with? Should we be sending our salmon there to be reprocessed and sent back to us? Is that a good idea? I just don't think so. I actually think it's insane. So, I think it begins with the consumer asking for the local stuff. Go to your local fishmonger, too. Don't always go to the supermarket. Fishmongers are a rarity nowadays. It used to be fishmongers controlled something like 80% of the seafood trade. Now they control less than 20%. And they need our support, and we need to bring them back because those are the people who have the knowledge. And if the supermarket doesn't have the knowledge, fire that person. Don't bring him over from the deli counter. Hire somebody who has the knowledge. But it has to begin with the consumer asking the right questions. So we'll end there. I think we'll do a little signing. If you want to ask more questions, if you go to my Twitter handle is #4FishGreenberg, so 4FishGreenberg. And my Facebook page is just facebook.com/4fish, but it's written out, F-U-R-fish. I only check it 30 to 40 times a day, so if I'm a little slow getting back to you, I apologize. But actually, I do like to ask questions, to answer questions, and I'm always looking for a good fish story. So, if you know a good story, I'm always digging around. So thank you very much for coming tonight.